The champagne flute trembled in my wife's manicured fingers as she stood before 150 wedding guests at the Riverside Country Club. September sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden shadows across her ivory silk dress. Natalie looked radiant, like she always did when she was about to destroy someone's life. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying that practiced PR consultant tone that had charmed clients for years, "I want to make a special toast tonight." I sat at the head table, loosening my tie after 6 hours of wedding festivities. My brother Jake's wedding had been flawless: expensive flowers, prime rib dinner, open bar flowing like the Mississippi. Everything Natalie had insisted we needed for our own wedding 3 years ago, except we'd settled for a backyard barbecue because I was just a freelance journalist scraping by on feature articles for regional magazines. "This toast," Natalie continued, "is for the man I've secretly loved for 10 years. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories." The room fell silent. I felt my stomach drop like a stone into cold water. Around me, guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. My father, Dr. Robert Brennan, raised his bushy gray eyebrows from across the table. Jake's new bride Tessa giggled nervously, probably thinking this was some cute romantic gesture. I watched my wife's face, searching for any sign this was heading somewhere good. But I knew Natalie's expressions better than anyone. The slight upturn of her lips meant she was savoring this moment. The way she held her shoulders back meant she felt powerful. The glint in her green eyes meant someone was about to get hurt. "Alex has been such a wonderful husband," she said, looking directly at me. "But tonight, I need to be honest about my feelings." My hands clenched into fists under the white tablecloth. Whatever was coming, I could feel it building like a thunderstorm on the horizon. "So this dance," Natalie raised her champagne flute higher, "is for the man who's held my heart all these years." She turned away from me and walked straight toward my brother Jake. The room erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. Jake's face went pale as Natalie extended her hand to him. He looked at me, then at his new wife, then back at Natalie. For a moment I thought he might refuse. I prayed he would refuse. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the dance floor. As they swayed to some romantic ballad the DJ had queued up, I sat frozen in my chair. My wife was dancing with my brother at his wedding reception, having just announced she'd been in love with him for a decade. The math was simple and brutal. She'd loved him before she'd even met me. "Jesus Christ, Alex," muttered my cousin Danny from the next table. "What the hell is happening?" I couldn't answer because I was asking myself the same question. But as I watched Natalie press closer to Jake, whispering something in his ear that made him smile, pieces started falling into place. Her late nights, working on campaigns, her sudden interest in fitness when Jake opened his gym, the way she always insisted we spend holidays with my family, specifically asking if Jake would be there. The song ended, but they didn't separate immediately. Jake's hands lingered on Natalie's waist. She looked up at him with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in months, maybe years. When they finally broke apart, Natalie walked back to our table like nothing had happened. She sat down beside me and picked up her champagne flute. "That felt good," she said quietly, just for me to hear. My father leaned across the table. "Alex, what exactly is going on here?" Before I could answer, Jake approached our table. His face was flushed, whether from embarrassment or excitement, I couldn't tell. "Alex, we need to talk," he said. "I bet we do." I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound cut through the awkward conversations happening at every table around us. "Not here." Jake glanced around at the staring guests. "Outside." "No," I said firmly. "Right here, in front of everyone. Since apparently that's how we're doing things tonight." Natalie grabbed my arm. Alex, don't make a scene. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, then at her face. Don't make a scene? You just announced you're in love with my brother at his wedding reception. I think the scene's already been made. It's not what you think, Jake started. Really? Then explain it to me. Explain to everyone. I gestured to the room full of guests who were now openly staring at us. Explain to your wife, who's been married to you for exactly 6 hours. Tessa had gone completely white. She clutched her bouquet like a life preserver, looking back and forth between Jake and Natalie. This is insane, she whispered. You want insane? I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope I'd been carrying all day. Dad, remember that favor I asked you for last week? My father nodded slowly. As a retired geneticist, he still had connections at the university lab where he'd worked for 30 years. The DNA test results came back, I announced to the room. Jake's face went from flushed to gray. Alex, what are you doing? I'm getting some answers. I handed the envelope to my father. Dad, would you mind reading the results? Out loud? Son, are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. My father opened the envelope with steady hands. He pulled out 2 sheets of paper and adjusted his reading glasses. The first test was to determine biological relationships within the Brennan family, he read in his clear, professional voice. Sample A, labeled Jake Brennan, shows no genetic markers consistent with Brennan family DNA. The room went completely silent. Even the catering staff stopped clearing tables. Jake collapsed into an empty chair. That's impossible. The second test, my father continued, was conducted on sample B, labeled Natalie Brennan pregnancy sample. Natalie shot to her feet. Stop! Stop right now! The results indicate the biological father of the 8-week pregnancy is the same individual as sample A, Jake Brennan. If the room had been quiet before, now it was a tomb. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Tessa's bouquet hit the ground as she stared at her new husband. You're pregnant? She whispered to Natalie. He got you pregnant? This is a mistake, Natalie said, but her voice cracked. The tests are wrong. I pulled out my phone and opened the text message thread I'd been saving for weeks. Should I read some of your texts out loud? The ones where you and Jake planned this whole thing? Alex, don't, Jake pleaded. But I was already reading. From Natalie to Jake, September 15th. Alex's trust fund kicks in after his dad dies. We just need to wait a little longer. Jake's response, what if he finds out about us? Natalie, he won't. He's too stupid and trusting. The guests were riveted now, leaning forward to catch every word. September 20th, Natalie to Jake. I'm pregnant. We need to speed up the timeline. Can you get access to his bank accounts? Jake. Through the family business, yeah. But what about Tessa? Natalie. She's temporary. Alex is temporary. It's always been you and me. Tessa let out a sob and ran toward the exit. Several guests followed her, but most stayed glued to their seats like they were watching a car accident. There's more, I continued. Plans to forge insurance documents. Plans to clean out my accounts after Dad's funeral, which, by the way, Dad's in perfect health. Plans to disappear together once they'd taken everything I had. Jake stood up unsteadily. Alex, let me explain. Explain what? That you're not actually my brother? That you've been sleeping with my wife? That you've been planning to rob me blind? My voice was getting louder, but I didn't care. Or maybe you want to explain how long this has been going on. 2 years, Natalie said quietly. The admission hung in the air like smoke. 2 years of lies. 2 years of betrayal. 2 years of planning my destruction. Well, I said, looking around the room at the shocked faces of friends and family. I guess that explains why you were so eager to renew our wedding vows last spring. You were already pregnant then, weren't you? Natalie's silence was answer enough. My father folded the test results and placed them back in the envelope. Alex, how long have you known? About Jake not being my brother? I've suspected for years. He never looked like us, never acted like family. About the affair? I looked directly at Natalie. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago. You knew? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. I knew everything. I just wanted to see how far you'd go. I gestured to the room full of witnesses. Apparently, this far. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. What did you do? Natalie demanded. I called the police an hour ago. Document fraud is a felony in Illinois. So is identity theft. Jake's been using the Brennan name for 35 years with no legal right to it. You've been filing joint tax returns with false information. The insurance fraud alone is enough for 5 years. 2 police officers entered the reception hall, their presence immediately commanding attention. Alex Brennan? One of them asked. That's me. You reported document fraud and identity theft? I did. I handed him a thick folder I'd prepared. Everything's documented. Bank records, forged documents, DNA evidence, recorded phone conversations. As the officers began reading through the evidence, Jake made one last desperate attempt. Alex, please, we're family. I looked at him, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time. No, I said, we're not. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant. I sat in a plastic chair that had probably been uncomfortable when it was new 20 years ago, watching through a window as Jake and Natalie were processed. They'd been separated immediately, Jake in one holding cell, Natalie in another. Neither of them looked like the confident conspirators who'd been planning my financial ruin just hours earlier. Detective Maria Santos, a compact woman with graying hair and tired eyes, sat across from me with a legal pad covered in notes. Mr. Brennan, I have to ask, why did you wait so long to report this? I needed evidence that would stick. Accusations are one thing, proof is another. She flipped through the folder I'd given her. This is thorough. Phone records, bank statements, DNA tests, recorded conversations. You've been building this case for months. 6 months, I confirmed. Ever since I found the first forged insurance document? And you never confronted them? I shook my head. I wanted to see the full scope of what they were planning. If I'd confronted them early, they might have destroyed evidence or disappeared. Detective Santos nodded approvingly. Smart. Most people would have lost their temper and confronted them immediately. I'm a journalist. I know how to investigate a story. This is more than a story, Mr. Brennan. This is your life. She was right, but I'd learned to compartmentalize. Treating the investigation like a professional assignment had kept me sane during the months of discovery. Every new piece of evidence had been like finding another paragraph of a story I was writing, devastating but fascinating. The DNA results, Detective Santos continued. How did you know to test for paternity? Natalie started showing morning sickness 6 weeks ago, but she told me she was just stressed about work. When I found texts between them talking about speeding up the timeline, I put 2 and 2 together. And you suspected Jake wasn't your biological brother? For years. My parents always said they adopted him when I was 3, but something never felt right. He looked nothing like our family. Different bone structure, different eye color, different mannerisms. When I started investigating the fraud, I figured I might as well get definitive answers about everything. Detective Santos made more notes. The recorded phone conversations, how did you obtain those? Illinois is a one-party consent state. I recorded conversations where I was a participant. Everything was legal. You've done your homework. I had to. They were planning to take everything I had and disappear. I couldn't afford to make mistakes. Through the window, I watched Jake pacing in his cell. He'd removed his wedding tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie. Every few minutes, he'd look toward the door like he expected someone to come tell him this was all a misunderstanding. What happens next? I asked. They'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Based on the evidence you've provided, the DA will likely file multiple felony charges: document fraud, identity theft, Conspiracy to commit fraud. If convicted, they're looking at significant prison time. And the baby? Detective Santos's expression softened slightly. That complicates things. The court will have to consider the pregnancy in sentencing. She might get house arrest or reduced time. I felt a stab of something. Not quite guilt, but close to it. The baby was innocent in all of this. But then I remembered the texts, the planning, the casual way they'd discussed destroying my life, and the feeling passed. Mr. Brennan, I have to ask, are you okay? This is a lot to process. Was I okay? My wife was pregnant with my brother's baby, except he wasn't my brother. They'd been planning to rob me and disappear together. My entire family structure had been revealed as a lie. 3 hours ago, I'd been married to someone I thought I knew. Now, I was sitting in a police station, having destroyed 2 lives in front of 150 wedding guests. I'm better than okay, I said, and realized I meant it. For the first time in months, I know exactly where I stand. My phone buzzed with a text message, then another, then a flood of them as the news spread beyond the wedding guests to the wider community. Natalie worked for one of the city's most prominent PR firms. Jake's gym was popular with the social media fitness crowd. This wasn't going to stay quiet. You might want to consider staying somewhere else tonight, Detective Santos suggested. Once this hits social media, you're going to have reporters and curious neighbors showing up. She was right. I could already see the headlines. Wedding DNA bombshell exposes decade-long affair. Local journalist catches wife and brother in elaborate fraud scheme. Country club wedding ends in police arrests. I'll go to my father's house, I said. Good choice. We'll need you to come back tomorrow for additional statements, but you're free to go for now. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable chair. Detective Santos, what are the chances they'll both be convicted? With evidence like this, very high. Your documentation is thorough, and fraud cases with this much premeditation rarely end in acquittals. I nodded and headed for the exit. As I reached the door, I heard Detective Santos call my name. Mr. Brennan, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to you, but I'm impressed by how you handled it. Thanks, though I'm not sure handled is the right word. More like survived. The parking lot outside the police station was nearly empty. My car sat under a streetlight, looking ordinary and innocent. Everything looked normal, but nothing would ever be normal again. I drove through the quiet streets toward my father's house, passing the country club where the wedding reception was probably still being cleaned up. I wondered if any guests had stayed to finish their meals after the police left with Jake and Natalie. I wondered if Tessa was okay, if she had family to support her through this mess. Most of all, I wondered what came next. My father was waiting on his front porch when I pulled into the driveway. Dr. Robert Brennan had always been a steady presence in my life, logical, methodical, unflappable. If anyone could help me process this disaster, it would be him. How are you holding up, son? I'm not sure yet. Ask me tomorrow. He handed me a glass of whiskey as I sat down in the porch swing beside him. I have to admit, I didn't see this coming. Which part? The affair, the fraud, or Jake not being your son? Any of it, all of it. He took a sip of his own drink. I've been thinking about Jake since you left for the police station. Looking back, there were signs. He never seemed quite connected to the family. You and Mom never suspected? We were told he was the biological son of your mother's cousin. She died in a car accident, and we agreed to raise him. We never questioned the paperwork. Someone lied to you. Apparently so. The question is who and why. I pulled out my phone and showed him one of the text conversations I hadn't read aloud at the wedding. Jake was asking Natalie about his real parents last month. She told him she'd hired a private investigator to find them. My father read the messages, his expression growing darker with each line. They were going to find his biological family and disappear with your money. That was the plan. Jesus, Alex. How long have you been carrying this around? 6 months of investigation. But I think I've known something was wrong for longer than that. Natalie changed about 2 years ago, became distant, secretive, started working late more often. I thought it was job stress. And Jake? Jake's been resentful for years, always felt like he didn't belong, never quite fit in. I think Natalie offered him something he'd been looking for his whole life, a way out, and someone who chose him over me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to crickets and the distant sound of traffic. The whiskey warmed my throat and settled my nerves. "What are you going to do now?" my father asked. "I don't know. File for divorce, obviously. Try to rebuild my life. Figure out who I am when I'm not being lied to and stolen from. You could write about this, turn it into a book or a series of articles." The idea had already occurred to me. It would be painful, but it might also be cathartic. And God knows I could use the money, assuming Jake and Natalie hadn't already cleaned out accounts I didn't know about. Maybe. Right now, I just want to sleep for about 12 hours and pretend this was all a nightmare. You can stay here as long as you need. Thanks, Dad. As I headed inside to the guest bedroom I'd used as a teenager, my phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from my editor at Chicago Monthly magazine. "Alex, heard about what happened at the wedding. Call me tomorrow. This could be the story of the year." I turned off the phone and fell asleep fully clothed, still wearing my wedding guest tie. I woke up to the sound of car doors slamming in my father's driveway. Through the bedroom window, I could see a news van with Channel 7's logo parked on the street. A reporter was checking her makeup in a compact mirror while her cameraman set up equipment. My phone showed 37 missed calls and 83 text messages. The wedding disaster had gone viral overnight. "Alex," my father called from downstairs, "you need to see this." I stumbled to the living room where Dad was watching the morning news. The lead story featured a shaky cell phone video of last night's DNA revelation, apparently recorded by one of the wedding guests. Shocking scene at an upscale wedding reception when a local journalist exposed his wife's affair with his brother using DNA evidence, the anchor was saying. The confrontation, which was captured on video, led to the arrest of both the wife and brother on fraud charges. The video quality was poor, but you could clearly hear my voice reading the DNA results and text messages. You could see Jake collapsing into his chair and Natalie trying to run. The audio picked up Tessa's sobs and the gasps from other guests. Social media is calling it the wedding DNA disaster, the anchor continued. The story has been shared over 100,000 times since last night, with many praising the husband's methodical approach to exposing the deception. They cut to an interview with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a family psychology expert, who was analyzing the situation for viewers. "What we're seeing here is a carefully planned revelation," Dr. Walsh explained. "This wasn't an emotional outburst. The husband clearly knew about the affair and fraud for some time and chose to expose it in the most public, humiliating way possible." "Is that healthy?" the anchor asked. "It's certainly effective. Public humiliation is one of the most powerful forms of social punishment. By exposing them at a wedding, in front of family and friends, he ensured maximum social consequences for their actions." My phone rang. The caller ID showed my editor's name. "Alex, thank God you're answering. Are you okay?" "Define okay, Marcus." "Fair enough. Listen, I know this is personal, but from a professional standpoint, this is huge. Everyone wants to hear your side of the story." "My side?" "You're the hero here, Alex. The wronged husband who outsmarted the cheaters. Social media is going crazy with support for you. Justice for Alex is trending on Twitter." I looked out the window. 2 more news vans had arrived, and a small crowd of neighbors and curiosity seekers was gathering on the sidewalk. "I don't feel like a hero, Marcus. I feel like someone whose life just exploded. That's what makes it such a compelling story. Look, I know this is difficult, but you could write your own narrative here. Control how this gets told. And frankly, You could make serious money doing it. Money. That was a consideration I hadn't fully processed yet. I needed to check my bank accounts, see what damage Jake and Natalie had already done. I needed to find a divorce lawyer. I needed to figure out if I could afford to keep my apartment or if I'd be living with my father indefinitely. Let me think about it. Don't think too long. The story's hot right now, but news cycles move fast. Strike while the iron's hot. After I hung up, my father brought me coffee and toast. Reporters have been calling the house phone all morning. I stopped answering after the 5th call. I'm sorry about this, Dad. I didn't think it would blow up like this. Don't apologize. You exposed the truth. Sometimes the truth is messy. I spent the morning avoiding phone calls and checking my finances online. The damage was worse than I'd expected. Jake had used his access to the family business accounts to transfer $15,000 to a personal account 3 weeks ago. Natalie had maxed out 2 credit cards in my name that I didn't even know existed. But it could have been worse. My trust fund was intact. They hadn't figured out how to access it yet. My checking account still had enough to cover rent and expenses for a few months. I wasn't ruined, just damaged. Around noon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Brennan, this is Chelsea Morrison. I was at the wedding last night. Chelsea. Natalie's maid of honor and closest friend. The one who'd fainted when I'd read the DNA results. What do you want, Chelsea? I want to apologize, and I want to tell you some things you should know. I'm listening. Can we meet somewhere? Not over the phone. There are things about Natalie, things I should have told you months ago. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop across town, away from the media circus at my father's house. I left through the back door and took side streets to avoid the news vans. Chelsea was already waiting when I arrived, looking like she hadn't slept. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Alex, I'm so sorry. I knew about the affair, and I should have told you. How long have you known? About a year. I caught them together at a hotel bar when Natalie was supposed to be at a work conference. She made me promise not to say anything. And you agreed? Chelsea's eyes filled with tears. She's been my best friend since college. I hoped she'd come to her senses and end it. Instead, she got pregnant. She told me last month. She was panicking about what to do. I told her she had to choose, you or Jake. She couldn't have both. Apparently, she chose Jake and my money. There's more. Chelsea pulled out her phone. I recorded a conversation with her 2 weeks ago. I was trying to talk her out of whatever she was planning. She played the recording. Natalie's voice was clear and cold. Alex is so trusting, so stupid. He has no idea what's coming. Jake and I have been planning this for months. Once we get access to his trust fund, we'll disappear. Maybe California, maybe overseas. The baby will grow up never knowing what a pathetic loser his real father was. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Hearing her voice, so casual and cruel, made the betrayal fresh all over again. Why are you showing me this now? Because I realized I've been protecting the wrong person. Natalie isn't the friend I thought she was. She's become someone I don't recognize. Can I have a copy of that recording? I already sent it to your phone. And Alex? There's something else. The private investigator she hired to find Jake's real parents. She also had him investigating your finances, your family, your daily routines. She's been planning this for over a year. The scope of the betrayal kept expanding. It wasn't just an affair that got out of hand. It was a calculated long-term plan to destroy my life and steal everything I had. Do you have any of that information? Chelsea handed me a flash drive. Everything I could find, photos, documents, more recordings. I've been collecting evidence for weeks trying to figure out how to handle this. You could have just told me. I know. I was a coward. I was afraid of losing Natalie's friendship, afraid of being wrong, afraid of getting involved. But after last night, seeing what she put you through, I realized I'd already lost my friend. The Natalie I knew wouldn't have done this to anyone. I pocketed the flash drive. More evidence for Detective Santos, more ammunition for the divorce proceedings. Chelsea, I need to ask you something. Do you think they would have gone through with it? The plan to disappear with my money? She nodded without hesitation. Absolutely. Natalie bought plane tickets to Los Angeles for next month, one-way tickets for her and Jake. She'd already started moving money into accounts you didn't know about. And the baby? She was going to tell you it was yours until after it was born. Then she was going to disappear with Jake and demand child support from you for a kid that isn't even yours. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not content with stealing my money and my brother, they were going to saddle me with 18 years of child support for Jake's baby. Thank you for telling me this. It's the least I could do. Alex, I know this doesn't help much, but you deserve so much better than what she did to you. As I drove back to my father's house, I felt a strange sense of clarity settling over me. The initial shock and hurt were giving way to something else. A cold, focused anger that felt more productive than destructive. Natalie and Jake had underestimated me. They'd seen me as weak, trusting, easily manipulated. They'd planned to destroy my life and disappear, leaving me broken and bankrupt. Instead, they were sitting in jail cells, facing felony charges, their reputations destroyed, their futures ruined. But somehow, that didn't feel like enough. The media circus had grown while I was gone. 5 news vans now lined the street, and reporters were interviewing neighbors about what kind of person I was. I parked in the back and snuck in through the kitchen. How did it go? My father asked. I showed him the flash drive Chelsea had given me. It's worse than we thought. They've been planning this for over a year. What are you going to do? I thought about Natalie's voice on the recording, calling me stupid and pathetic. I thought about Jake transferring my money while pretending to be my brother. I thought about the baby they were going to use to steal from me for the next 18 years. I'm going to make sure they never hurt anyone else the way they hurt me. What does that mean? I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. 3 days after the wedding disaster, I was sitting in divorce attorney Sarah Mitchell's office, surrounded by boxes of evidence that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning nearly 2 years. Mr. Brennan, in 23 years of practice, I've never seen documentation this thorough, Sarah said, flipping through bank statements, recorded conversations, and surveillance photos. You've essentially built the entire case for us. I'm a journalist. Documentation is what I do. This goes beyond journalism. This is forensic-level investigation. She held up a photograph of Jake and Natalie entering a hotel together 6 months ago. Where did you get this? I hired a private investigator after I found the first forged document. I wanted to know everything. Sarah pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. Based on what you've shown me, we can pursue divorce on grounds of adultery, fraud, and abandonment. The prenup Natalie signed becomes void due to her criminal activity. You'll keep everything: the house, the cars, your business assets, your trust fund. What about the baby? DNA evidence proves it's not yours. You'll have no financial responsibility. In fact, given the attempted fraud, we might be able to pursue damages against her. My phone buzzed with yet another interview request. The story had grown beyond local news. National media outlets were picking it up. A producer from a true crime podcast had called that morning, wanting to do a 6-part series on the case. There's something else, Sarah continued. The criminal charges against them are more serious than initially reported. The DA's office called this morning. They're adding conspiracy charges and elevating the fraud charges to Class 2 felonies. What does that mean? If convicted, they're each looking at 3 to 7 years in prison. 7 years. The number hung in the air between us. 7 years of their lives destroyed because they'd tried to destroy mine. Are you okay with that? Sarah asked, studying my expression. I don't know. Ask me when the shock wears off. After leaving the lawyer's office, I drove to Jake's gym. I'd been avoiding it since the wedding, but I needed to see what was happening with his business. The parking lot was nearly empty. A for sale sign had been planted in the landscaping near the entrance. Through the windows, I could see exercise equipment covered with tarps. Alex? I turned to find Marcus Webb, one of Jake's business partners, walking toward me. Marcus and I had been casual friends before all this happened. We'd played poker together, watched football games, shared beers after work. Marcus, how are you holding up? Better than Jake, I imagine. His tone was cold, different from the friendly voice I remembered. We had to close the gym. No one wants to work out at a place owned by a fraud. I'm sorry about that. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you destroyed 2 lives for revenge. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I could have handled this privately. I could have confronted them, filed for divorce quietly, reported the fraud to police without the public spectacle. They were stealing from me, Marcus, planning to disappear with everything I had. So you humiliated them in front of 150 people and sent them to prison? I exposed the truth. You destroyed them. Marcus stepped closer, his voice getting louder. Jake made mistakes, but he didn't deserve to have his entire life ruined. And now 3 other people are unemployed because you had to make a public spectacle of your revenge. Other people. I hadn't considered the collateral damage. Jake's gym employed 4 people. His business partner had invested his savings. Clients had paid for memberships and personal training packages. That's not my fault. Isn't it? You could have handled this privately. Instead, you turned it into a circus for your own satisfaction. My satisfaction? My wife was pregnant with my brother's baby while planning to rob me blind. How exactly should I have handled that? Like an adult, like someone who cared about the consequences of his actions. A small crowd was gathering to watch our argument. Someone was recording with their phone, probably hoping to capture another viral moment from the wedding DNA disaster saga. You know what, Marcus? You're right. I should have just let them steal my money and disappear. I should have raised Jake's baby and paid child support for 18 years while they lived in California spending my trust fund. That would have been the adult thing to do. That's not what I'm saying. That's exactly what you're saying. You think I should have taken it quietly like a good victim. Well, I'm not a victim anymore. No, now you're something worse. You're a person who destroys lives for revenge. The words hit harder than I expected. Was that what I'd become? Was that how people saw me? I left Marcus standing in the parking lot and drove home, to my father's house, since I wasn't sure I could call anywhere else home anymore. Dad was in his study, reading medical journals like he'd done every evening for as long as I could remember. The routine was comforting in its normalcy. How did it go with the lawyer? Good. The divorce should be straightforward. Criminal case is getting more serious. And how are you doing with all that? I told him about the conversation with Marcus, about the accusation that I'd destroyed lives for revenge. Do you think he's right? Dad asked. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I slumped into the leather chair across from his desk. I keep telling myself I was just exposing the truth, but the truth is, I wanted to hurt them. I wanted them to suffer the way they made me suffer. That's human, Alex. What they did to you was cruel and calculated. Wanting justice isn't the same as wanting revenge. Is there a difference? Justice is about consequences fitting actions. Revenge is about making someone suffer because they made you suffer. The question is, which one were you pursuing? I thought about the wedding scene, about choosing to expose them publicly instead of privately. I thought about the satisfaction I'd felt watching them get arrested, seeing their plans crumble in front of everyone they knew. Probably both. The important thing is what you do next. What do you mean? You've exposed them. They're facing consequences. The question now is whether you're going to spend the rest of your life defined by what they did to you, or whether you're going to build something better. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus's words, about the gym employees who'd lost their jobs, about Tessa trying to process that her new husband had been living a lie for 35 years. At 2 a.m., I got up and started writing. Not an article for publication, not a book proposal, just thoughts on paper. An attempt to make sense of what had happened and what it meant. I wrote about the moment I'd found the first forged document, the sick feeling in my stomach when I'd realized my wife was stealing from me. I wrote about hiring the private investigator, about the nights I'd lain awake knowing Natalie was texting Jake while lying next to me. I wrote about the wedding scene, about the satisfaction and horror of watching their faces as their secrets were exposed. I wrote about the aftermath, the media attention, the accusations from former friends. By dawn, I had 12 pages of raw, honest reflection on the worst and best 6 months of my life. My phone rang as I was making coffee. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Alex, this is Tessa, Jake's wife." I almost hung up. The last thing I needed was another person telling me I'd ruined their life. "Tessa, I'm sorry about—" "Don't apologize. I called to thank you." That stopped me cold. "Thank you? You saved me from a life built on lies. If you hadn't exposed this, I would have spent years married to someone who wasn't who he claimed to be. I would have raised children thinking they had a father and uncle who were actually strangers. I didn't do it for you. I know. You did it for yourself. But the result is the same. I'm free now. Free to find someone who won't lie to me about who they are. How are you handling all this?" "Better than I expected. My family is supportive. I'm seeing a therapist. I'm filing for annulment. Turns out our marriage was based on fraudulent identity, so it was never legal anyway." "And Jake?" "I haven't spoken to him since the wedding. I don't plan to. Whatever he's going through, he brought it on himself." After we hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe Marcus was right that I'd destroyed lives for revenge. But maybe Tessa was also right that some lives needed to be destroyed because they were built on lies. Maybe both things could be true at the same time. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor. "Alex, decision time. Publishers are calling. You could have a book deal by the end of the week if you want it." I looked at the 12 pages I'd written during the night, at the raw honesty of trying to understand my own motivations and actions. Maybe it was time to tell the whole story, not just the parts that made me look like a hero or a villain, but the messy, complicated truth of what happens when your life explodes and you have to decide who you want to be in the aftermath. I texted back, "Let's talk." 2 weeks after the wedding, I was sitting in a Chicago publisher's office, listening to an editor explain how my story could become a best-selling memoir. "The public is fascinated by your case," Jennifer Walsh explained. "It has everything: betrayal, revenge, justice, a shocking twist. But what makes it special is that you documented everything. Readers love that methodical approach." "It wasn't methodical by choice. I'm just naturally paranoid." She laughed. "That paranoia saved your life, and it could make you a very wealthy man." The advance they were offering was more than I'd made in the last 3 years of freelance journalism combined. Enough to buy a house, start over, build a new life independent of the wreckage Jake and Natalie had left behind. "There's just one thing," Jennifer continued. "We'd want you to include everything. The investigation, the confrontation, but also the aftermath. How this changed you, what you learned about yourself. The ugly parts too? Especially the ugly parts. Readers don't want a saint. They want someone real, someone who makes mistakes and questions their own motives." I thought about the conversation with Marcus, about the gym employees who'd lost their jobs, about the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I'd gone too far. "I can do that." "Excellent. We'd want the manuscript in 6 months. Think you can manage that timeline?" 6 months to turn the worst period of my life into a coherent narrative. 6 months to figure out what it all meant and how to tell the story honestly. "I'll make it work." After signing the preliminary paperwork, I drove back to my father's house to find Detective Santos waiting on the front porch. "Mr. Brennan, we need to talk." "Is everything okay?" "That depends on your definition of okay. Can we go inside?" Dad was at his weekly golf game, so we had the house to ourselves. Detective Santos looked tired, like she'd been working long hours. "Jake and Natalie's cases go to trial next month," she began. "The DA wants to make sure you're prepared for what that's going to involve." "I'll testify. I've got all the evidence organized." "It's not just about testimony. Their defense attorneys are going to try to paint you as vindictive, as someone who set up an elaborate revenge scheme. They're going to argue that you entrapped them." "Entrapped them? They were stealing from me." "I know that. You know that. But juries can be unpredictable, especially when defense attorneys start talking about cruel and unusual punishment." "What do you mean?" Detective Santos pulled out a folder. "Jake's attorney is arguing that exposing them publicly at the wedding constitutes emotional abuse. They're saying you could have handled this privately, but chose public humiliation instead." "So what if I did?" "So a jury might decide that while they committed fraud, you went too far in exposing them. They might recommend reduced sentences or even acquittal on some charges." The possibility that Jake and Natalie might escape serious consequences hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on the satisfaction of exposing them that I hadn't considered how it might look to outsiders. "What can I do about it?" "Be prepared for aggressive cross-examination. They're going to try to make you look like the villain. They'll ask about your motivations, your methods, your decision to create a public spectacle." "And I should say what?" "The truth. That you were protecting yourself from people who were systematically destroying your life." After Detective Santos left, I called Sarah Mitchell to discuss trial strategy. "I've been expecting this," she said when I explained the defense approach. "It's their only play. They can't deny the fraud, so they have to make you look worse than they are." "Will it work?" "Depends on the jury. Some people will see you as a hero who outsmarted criminals. Others will see you as someone who went too far for revenge. What's your honest assessment?" "I think you'll win, but it might not be as clean as we hoped. Jake and Natalie will probably get some prison time, but maybe less than they deserve." That evening, I started working on the book in earnest. If the trial was going to put my motivations under a microscope, I needed to understand them myself. I wrote about the night I'd found the first forged insurance document, about the sick realization that my wife was stealing from me. I wrote about the decision to hire a private investigator instead of confronting her directly. The hardest part was writing about the wedding scene itself, trying to capture both the satisfaction of exposing them and the growing realization that I'd enjoyed their humiliation more than I should have. 3 days later, my phone rang with a call from Jake. "Alex, please. I need to talk to you." "We have nothing to talk about." 5 minutes, please. I'm at the county jail. They'll let me make one call." Against my better judgment, I agreed to visit him. The county jail was a depressing concrete building that smelled like disinfectant and despair. Jake looked terrible, thinner, pale, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. "Thank you for coming." "What do you want, Jake?" "I want to apologize, and I want to ask you to consider dropping the charges." "Are you insane?" "Alex, I know what we did was wrong, but prison isn't going to solve anything. It's just going to destroy 2 more lives. You destroyed your own lives when you decided to steal from me. We made mistakes." "Mistakes? You spent 2 years planning to rob me and disappear. You got my wife pregnant. You forged documents and stole money. Those aren't mistakes. They're felonies." Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know you hate me. I know you want me to suffer. But what about the baby? What about Natalie's future? What about my future? What about the 18 years of child support you were going to steal from me? What about my trust fund you were planning to empty? We weren't going to take everything. You were going to take everything and leave me with nothing. Don't lie to me now, Jake. I have the text messages. Jake's shoulders sagged. I know we went too far. But Alex, we're family. No, we're not. The DNA test proved that. Family isn't just about blood. You're the only brother I've ever known. For a moment, I felt something like sympathy. Jake had grown up believing he was a Brennan, believing he belonged to our family. Learning the truth must have been devastating. But then I remembered Natalie's voice on the recording, calling me stupid and pathetic. I remembered the forged documents, the stolen money, the elaborate plan to disappear with my life savings. If I was your brother, you wouldn't have tried to destroy me. We weren't trying to destroy you. Yes, you were. You were going to take everything I had and leave me broke and alone, raising a baby that wasn't mine. That's destruction, Jake. I stood up to leave. Alex, wait. What if I testified against Natalie? What if I told the court it was all her idea? Was it? Jake hesitated just long enough to give me my answer. I didn't think so. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. Jake wasn't the brother I'd grown up with. He was a stranger who'd been living in my family for 35 years. The person I'd thought I knew had never existed. That night, I wrote about the jail visit, about the last remnants of sympathy I'd felt for Jake, and how they'd evaporated when he'd tried to blame everything on Natalie. I wrote about the complexity of betrayal, about how the people who hurt us most are usually the people we've trusted most. I wrote about the difference between justice and revenge, and how sometimes the line between them is thinner than we'd like to admit. The book was becoming something I hadn't expected, not just a story of betrayal and revenge, but an examination of what happens to a person when their entire understanding of their life turns out to be wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Santos. Trial date set for next month. Are you ready? I looked at the pages I'd written, at the honest accounting of my own motivations and actions. As ready as I'll ever be, I texted back. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Jake and Natalie sat at separate defense tables with their attorneys, both looking pale and defeated. The media attention had only intensified in the weeks leading up to the trial, with legal analysts debating whether I was a hero or a villain. The prosecution will show that the defendants engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud and deception, Assistant DA Patricia Romano announced in her opening statement. They forged documents, stole money, and planned to disappear with the victim's life savings while leaving him to raise a child that wasn't his. Jake's attorney, David Chen, painted a different picture in his opening statement. My client made mistakes, but he was manipulated by a woman who saw him as a means to an end. Jake Brennan believed he was part of a family, only to discover that everything he'd been told about his identity was a lie. His actions, while wrong, were the desperate acts of a man trying to find where he belonged. Natalie's attorney, Rebecca Torres, was even more aggressive. The real villain in this case isn't my client. It's Alex Brennan, a man so consumed with revenge that he orchestrated an elaborate public humiliation designed to destroy 2 lives. He could have handled this privately, but he chose cruelty instead. Over the next 3 days, I watched as the prosecution methodically presented the evidence I'd gathered. Bank records, forged documents, recorded conversations, DNA tests, everything laid out in chronological order to show the scope and duration of their deception. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecution questions were straightforward. Yes, I'd discovered the fraud. Yes, I'd hired a private investigator. Yes, I'd gathered evidence over several months. Why didn't you confront your wife and brother immediately when you first suspected the affair? Patricia Romano asked. Because I needed to understand the full scope of what they were planning. If I'd confronted them early, they might have destroyed evidence or accelerated their timeline. What was their timeline? They were planning to disappear next month with approximately $200,000 from my trust fund, plus whatever they could steal from other accounts. The cross-examination was brutal. David Chen spent 2 hours trying to paint me as vindictive and cruel. Mr. Brennan, you could have reported the fraud to police privately, couldn't you? Yes. You could have filed for divorce quietly? Yes. But instead, you chose to humiliate my client and Ms. Foster in front of 150 wedding guests? I chose to expose the truth publicly. For revenge? I paused, thinking about the honest answer. Partially, yes. They were planning to destroy my life. I wanted consequences that matched their actions. So, this was about revenge? This was about justice. They planned to steal everything I had and disappear. I made sure that wouldn't happen. Rebecca Torres was even more aggressive during her cross-examination. Mr. Brennan, you recorded private conversations without the other party's knowledge? Illinois is a one-party consent state. The recordings were legal. Legal, but was it ethical? More ethical than planning to steal someone's life savings? You hired a private investigator to follow my client? I hired a private investigator to document criminal activity. You orchestrated an elaborate public humiliation at a wedding? I exposed criminal fraud at a public event? For your own satisfaction? For justice? Torres leaned forward. Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you enjoyed watching my client and Mr. Brennan suffer? I thought about lying, about giving the answer that would make me look better, but I'd promised myself to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable. Yes, I did enjoy it. They spent 2 years planning to destroy me. Watching their plans fall apart was satisfying. So this was about revenge? This was about consequences. They made choices. I made sure they faced the results of those choices. The defense put Jake and Natalie on the stand, and both told similar stories. They'd fallen in love, made mistakes, but never intended to hurt anyone. They painted themselves as victims of circumstance, people who'd gotten in over their heads. Jake's testimony was particularly painful to watch. He talked about growing up feeling like he didn't belong, about learning he wasn't biologically related to the family that raised him, about feeling lost and desperate for connection. I know what we did was wrong, he said, tears streaming down his face. But I was trying to find my place in the world. Natalie made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Natalie's testimony was more calculated. She admitted to the affair, but claimed the fraud was Jake's idea. I was pregnant and scared, she said. Jake convinced me that Alex would never find out, that we could start fresh somewhere else. I should have said no, but I was in love and not thinking clearly. During the prosecution's rebuttal, Patricia Romano played the recording Chelsea had given me, Natalie's voice calling me stupid and pathetic, discussing their plans to disappear with my money. Does that sound like someone who was scared and not thinking clearly? Romano asked the jury. Or does it sound like someone who was cold and calculating in her plans to defraud her husband? Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon. Both defense attorneys made emotional appeals for leniency, arguing that their clients had already suffered enough public humiliation. Alex Brennan got his revenge, Rebecca Torres told the jury. He destroyed 2 lives in the most public, cruel way possible. Isn't that punishment enough? Patricia Romano's closing was methodical and devastating. The defendants want you to believe this case is about a man's cruel revenge. It's not. It's about 2 people who systematically planned to defraud someone who trusted them. They forged documents, stole money, and planned to disappear with $200,000. The only reason they didn't succeed is because their victim was smart enough to stop them. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to read the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant Jake Brennan guilty. On the charge of document fraud, we find the defendant Jake Brennan guilty. On the charge of identity theft, we find the defendant Jake Brennan guilty. Jake collapsed into his chair as the guilty verdicts continued. 3 felony convictions. Natalie's verdicts were identical. Guilty on all counts. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the message was clear. Both Jake and Natalie were going to prison. As I left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about how I felt, whether I thought justice had been served, what I planned to do next. "I'm satisfied with the verdict," I told them. "The jury saw the evidence and made their decision based on facts, not emotions." "Do you feel vindicated?" one reporter asked. "I feel like the truth came out. That's all I wanted." But that wasn't entirely true. I felt vindicated, relieved, and satisfied. I also felt empty, like I'd been carrying anger for so long that I didn't know what to do without it. 3 weeks later, Jake was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Natalie got 3 years, with the possibility of house arrest for the final year due to her pregnancy. I sat in the courtroom as they were led away in handcuffs, watching the final chapter of a story that had consumed my life for almost a year. That night, I finished the last chapter of my book. I wrote about the trial, about watching Jake and Natalie face the consequences of their choices, about the strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness I felt. I wrote about the question that had haunted me throughout the process, whether I was pursuing justice or revenge, and whether there was really a difference. In the end, I decided both could be true. I had wanted justice, consequences that matched their actions, but I had also wanted revenge, to see them suffer the way they'd made me suffer. Maybe that made me a flawed person. Maybe it made me human. 6 months later, my book, The Last Toast, a true story of betrayal and justice, hit bestseller lists across the country. The advance and royalties were enough to buy a house, start over, build a new life. I used some of the money to set up a fund for the employees who'd lost their jobs when Jake's gym closed. It wasn't their fault their boss turned out to be a fraud. I also sent a check to Tessa, enough to cover her legal fees and help her start over. She'd been an innocent victim in all of this, someone who'd married a man who didn't exist. Jake and Natalie both tried to contact me from prison, asking for money, for help with appeals, for forgiveness. I never responded. Some people called me a hero for exposing them. Others called me cruel for the way I'd done it. I learned to live with both assessments. The truth, as I'd learned, was more complicated than either heroes or villains. Sometimes good people do bad things for understandable reasons. Sometimes victims become perpetrators. Sometimes justice and revenge are the same thing. 2 years after the wedding, I was in my new house, working on a second book, when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a young woman I didn't recognize. "Mr. Brennan? My name is Lisa Chen. I think you knew my brother Jake." I opened the door, studying her face. She had Jake's eyes, his bone structure. This was what he'd been looking for, his real family. "I found him through the news coverage of his trial," she continued. "I've been looking for him for years. Our mother gave him up for adoption when he was a baby, but she never stopped thinking about him. What do you want from me?" "Nothing. I just wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For exposing the truth. Jake spent his whole life feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. Now he knows where he came from. He knows he has a family who wants him. He's in prison. I know. I visit him every month. When he gets out, he'll have somewhere to go, people who love him. In a strange way, what you did gave him what he'd been looking for his whole life." After she left, I sat on my porch thinking about the complexity of consequences. I'd destroyed Jake's life to save my own, but in the process, I'd inadvertently given him something he'd always wanted, knowledge of where he came from. Maybe that was justice too. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor. "Alex, how's the new book coming? Publishers are excited about the follow-up." I looked at the pages I'd written about rebuilding after betrayal, about learning to trust again, about the difference between justice and revenge. "It's coming along," I texted back, almost ready for the world to read. 3 months later, I was signing books at a Chicago bookstore when I saw a familiar face in line. Marcus Webb, Jake's former business partner, the man who'd accused me of destroying lives for revenge. When he reached the signing table, he looked uncomfortable but determined. "Alex, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. I blamed you for what happened to Jake's business, for the people who lost their jobs. But I found out last week that Jake had been stealing from the business account for months. He would have destroyed us anyway, even if you hadn't exposed him. I'm sorry to hear that. The thing is, you saved us from worse damage. If you hadn't stopped him when you did, he might have taken everything. We might have lost our houses, our savings, everything. I signed his book and handed it back. Sometimes the truth is messy, but it's still better than lies. I understand that now. What you did took courage. I'm sorry I didn't see it at the time. As the bookstore event ended and I packed up my things, I reflected on how the story had continued to evolve long after I thought it was finished. Jake had found his real family. His business partners had learned they'd been victims too. Tessa had rebuilt her life and was engaged to someone who didn't lie about his identity. Even Natalie, according to news reports, had given birth to a healthy baby and was serving the remainder of her sentence under house arrest. The child would grow up knowing the truth about his parents, which was more than Jake had been given. Everyone's life had been disrupted, but maybe everyone's life had also been improved by the truth coming out. That night, I finished the final chapter of my second book. I wrote about the bookstore encounter, about Marcus's apology, about the ongoing ripple effects of that wedding night 2 years ago. I wrote about learning that justice isn't a single moment, but an ongoing process. That consequences continue long after the initial action. That sometimes destroying something built on lies is the only way to create space for something built on truth. The last line I wrote was, "The truth is never as simple as we want it to be, but it's always simpler than the lies we tell to avoid it." I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of whiskey, the same brand my father had served me on the night after the wedding. Outside my window, I could see the lights of the city, millions of people living their own complicated stories of love and betrayal, justice and revenge, truth and lies. My story had become public, dissected in courtrooms and book reviews and social media debates. But in the end, it was just one story among millions. A story about what happens when the life you thought you knew turns out to be built on deception and what you choose to do about it. I'd chosen to fight back. Others might have chosen differently. There was no single right answer, no perfect response to betrayal. But there was truth, and there were consequences, and sometimes that had to be enough.